In the year 1305, beneath a grey sky that seemed to press down on the streets of London, a man was dragged through the city by a horse, his body broken, his fate already sealed. Yet what was about to happen to him would not end with death, because the punishment waiting for him had been designed not just to kill, but to send a message so terrifying that it would echo across an entire kingdom. The man was William Wallace, a figure who had become the face of resistance against English rule, a leader whose name inspired rebellion and whose actions had turned him into one of the most wanted men in Britain. But before this story is over, what was done to his body, to his memory, and to those who followed him will reveal a level of calculated brutality that goes far beyond the simple idea of execution. Because Wallace was not just meant to die, he was meant to be erased, displayed, and transformed into a warning so powerful that no one would dare rise again. And the system that carried out this punishment was not acting in anger alone, but with a deliberate method shaped by centuries of authority and control. If you want to uncover the darkest moments of history, where power is enforced not just through victory, but through fear itself, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because what happened after Wallace's death is a story rarely told in full. To understand why his fate was so extreme, we need to go back to the years before his capture, when Scotland was locked in a struggle that would define its future. At the centre of this conflict stood Edward I of England, a ruler determined to bring Scotland under his control, not as an ally, but as a territory firmly within his expanding influence. Edward was not simply a king defending his borders. He was an empire builder, a man who believed that authority could only be maintained through strength, and that rebellion had to be crushed completely, without compromise. Scotland, however, was not a passive land waiting to be absorbed. Its nobles, warriors, and common people resisted, sometimes divided, sometimes united, but always aware that submission would mean the loss of their independence. It was in this unstable and dangerous environment that William Wallace rose to prominence. Unlike many leaders of his time, Wallace did not come from the highest ranks of nobility, which made his rise even more remarkable, and to some, more threatening. He became known not just for his defiance, but for his ability to inspire others to fight against forces that seemed overwhelming. One of the defining moments of his early campaign came at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where his forces achieved a stunning victory against the English, using terrain and timing to overcome a more heavily equipped enemy. This victory transformed Wallace from a rebel leader into a symbol, a figure whose success suggested that England's power could be challenged. But success in war is rarely permanent, and the response from Edward I was swift and decisive. The English king launched a campaign designed not just to defeat Wallace, but to dismantle the resistance entirely. At the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's forces faced a devastating defeat, as English tactics and superior resources turned the tide against the Scottish army. After this loss, Wallace's position became increasingly difficult to maintain. Alliances weakened, support became uncertain, and the man who had once led armies was forced into a more isolated existence, moving between allies and avoiding capture. For years he remained a symbol of resistance, but also a target, pursued relentlessly by those who saw his continued freedom as a threat to stability. Eventually, betrayal would do what armies could not. In 1305, Wallace was captured, handed over to English authorities by individuals who chose survival or advantage over loyalty. He was taken to London, not as a prisoner of war in the traditional sense, but as an example. The charges brought against him were not merely political. He was accused of treason, a crime that carried one of the most severe punishments available under English law. Yet the accusation itself revealed a deeper contradiction. Wallace had never sworn loyalty to the English crown in the way that many nobles had. From his perspective, he was not a traitor. He was a defender of his own land. But the legal system that judged him did not recognise that distinction. In the eyes of Edward I of England, resistance was rebellion, and rebellion demanded a response that would eliminate not just the individual, but the idea they represented. The trial was swift, and the outcome was never in doubt. Wallace was sentenced to a punishment reserved for those considered the greatest threats to the state, a method designed to maximise suffering and visibility. When the day of execution arrived, the process began long before death itself. He was dragged through the streets, exposed to the public, his condition deteriorating as the journey continued, a spectacle meant to draw attention and reinforce authority. The execution that followed was carried out with a precision that reflected not chaos, but intention. Each stage was meant to prolong the experience, to demonstrate control, and to ensure that the message reached as many people as possible. Yet even this was not the end of what had been planned, because the true horror of Wallace's fate did not end with his final breath. What happened next was designed to outlast him, to turn his body into a symbol of punishment that would extend far beyond the moment of his death. And it is this part of the story, the part that is often shortened or softened, that reveals just how far authority was willing to go to maintain power. What followed the execution of William Wallace was not an ending in any meaningful sense, but the continuation of a process carefully designed to extend punishment beyond death itself, transforming a fallen rebel into a lasting instrument of fear that could be seen, remembered, and understood by anyone who might consider defying the authority of Edward I of England. Once Wallace's life had been taken, his body was subjected to a method of posthumous display that was as deliberate as it was symbolic, a process intended to dismantle not only the physical remains of the man, but also the identity and unity that he had come to represent among those who resisted English rule. His head was removed and prepared for public exhibition, eventually placed on London Bridge, where it would remain as a stark and unmistakable warning to all who entered the city, a reminder that rebellion against the crown would not simply end in death, but in a form of humiliation that extended far beyond it. The rest of his body was divided into multiple parts and sent to different locations across the kingdom, including key cities in Scotland, where each piece served as a localised symbol of control, reinforcing the reach of English authority into regions that had resisted its influence. This act was not random or excessive in the eyes of those who ordered it, but part of a broader strategy that combined legal punishment with psychological impact, ensuring that Wallace's fate would be witnessed not just by those present at his execution, but by entire communities who would encounter its aftermath. In this way, the punishment achieved something that a simple execution could not, embedding itself into the memory of the population and shaping behaviour through fear rather than force alone. For the English crown, this was a demonstration of power, a clear message that the consequences of rebellion would be absolute and inescapable, reaching beyond the individual to affect how others thought, acted, and made decisions in the future. But for many in Scotland, the effect was not what had been intended. Instead of erasing Wallace's influence, these actions transformed him into something far more enduring, a figure whose suffering became intertwined with the identity of resistance itself. Stories of his life and death spread, carrying with them not just the details of his execution, but the meaning attached to it by those who refused to accept the authority that had ordered it. Over time, these stories would evolve, shaped by memory, culture, and the need to find meaning in events that were both tragic and transformative. Wallace became more than a historical figure, becoming instead a symbol of defiance, a representation of the idea that even in defeat, resistance could leave a lasting impact. This transformation did not happen immediately, nor was it uniform, but it reflects the complex relationship between power and memory, where attempts to suppress a narrative can sometimes amplify it instead. Meanwhile, the political situation in Scotland remained unstable, with competing factions, shifting alliances, and ongoing conflict that made the future uncertain. The removal of Wallace did not end the struggle for independence, but it did change its nature, opening the way for new leaders to emerge and new strategies to be developed. Among these figures was Robert the Bruce, a man whose path to leadership was complicated by his own choices and the difficult realities of the time, yet who would eventually play a decisive role in shaping Scotland's future. The years following Wallace's death were marked by continued resistance, setbacks, and gradual shifts in power that would culminate in a renewed effort to challenge English control. In this context, the memory of Wallace did not fade, but remained present as a reminder of both the cost of resistance and the possibility of eventual success. The English crown, for its part, continued to enforce its authority through a combination of military action and political pressure, seeking to maintain control over a region that refused to fully submit. Yet the very methods used to assert that control, including the extreme punishment of figures like Wallace, contributed to an environment where opposition could not be completely extinguished, because fear, while powerful, is not always enough to secure lasting loyalty. In some cases, it creates the conditions for further resistance, strengthening the resolve of those who view submission as unacceptable. This dynamic would continue to shape the conflict between England and Scotland, influencing decisions on both sides and contributing to a struggle that extended far beyond the life of any single individual. Looking back on these events, it becomes clear that the story of William Wallace is not simply one of defeat or even of martyrdom, but of transformation, where the actions taken to destroy his influence ultimately helped to preserve and redefine it. The horror that followed his execution was real, calculated, and intended to dominate both body and memory. Yet it also revealed the limits of power when confronted with ideas that cannot be easily controlled. Because while a body can be broken, displayed, and divided, the meaning attached to it can continue to evolve, shaped by those who remember and reinterpret it over time. And in that sense, the attempt to end Wallace's story did not succeed in the way it was intended. Instead, it ensured that his name would endure, not as a warning against resistance, but as a symbol of it. If you want to explore more stories where history reveals the true cost of power, where the line between fear and resistance becomes blurred, then subscribe to the channel and like the video, because the past is filled with moments like this, where even the most brutal endings can lead to something that refuses to disappear.